All right, Frank Falzon, legendary homicide inspector with the SFPD, 28 years, over 300 homicides you investigated. Tell me just broadly, what was it like investigating all those cases?
Looking back now, it was absolutely insane. But when I was living it, I was caught up in the time. It was a challenge. And I wasn't alone. There were 16 men in that unit and a lieutenant. And each team, they were amazing guys, top of the line detectives, and everybody trying to solve their cases. It was a job that I strived for, achieved, and hated to leave. I couldn't wait to get to work to see what new thing was going to happen that particular day. San Francisco, like no other city in the world. I was born and raised there. I love San Francisco.
Was San Francisco the same city that it is today? We're talking about the turbulent 1970s and 80s when there was an unprecedented level of violence, particularly in the city.
The violence in the 70s is so hard to describe. The only way I can say it is by explaining what was going on. We had the zebra murders. This was a cult within the Nation of Islam where blacks were randomly, for no reason at all, killing whites. We had Zodiac, who was taunting the public, writing missives to the Chronicle in cryptic lettering, threatened to kill children coming off a bus. We had the Black Liberation Army, we had the SLA, we had the Patty Hearst kidnapping, we had Sergeant Jack Young gunned down at Ingleside Station, we had Brian McDonald, sergeant killed out at Park Station with a bomb. It was murder on steroids. It was absolutely an insane time in San Francisco history. You go back a few years, in I think it was 58 or 57, the city had 27 murders, and the homicide unit solved them all. And with relatively the same amount of men in the 70s and 80s, we were averaging in the high 120s up to about 150 murders a year.
And this was also during an era before there was DNA, before video cameras were ubiquitous. You really had to rely on old school investigative techniques.
To show you how, I guess archaic would be the word, we used to have to carry dimes in our pocket when we walked the beat, so we could make a phone call from a phone booth or find a call box which were randomly placed throughout the city because we had no walkie-talkies, we had no cell phones, we had no way to be in touch once we were out on the street. So yes, cases had to be solved the old-fashioned way, knocking on doors, turning over every rock, every stone, look behind every bush, and people, asking people to help. The sad thing is, in a lot of the poorer areas of San Francisco, these people are actually prisoners within the projects, and it would break my heart because these people wanted to help us, but they would say, "Inspector, we have to live here. We point to our neighbor as a killer. Do you think we'll be alive tomorrow?" It's very tough dealing with those kind of situations. The best we could offer is maybe move somebody from Hunters Point project area or Sunnydale project area and see if we couldn't move them down to Bay Street in the marina, so they would testify for us in the court of law in order to gain a conviction. So it wasn't easy, but like I said, the men I worked with, so proud to be part of that team. They got the job done.
What was your motivation to do it for all of those years? Was it catching killers? Was it saving lives? Was it getting bad guys off the street?
I know my motivation was my father. He was my inspiration, passed away when I was 8 years old. He always said, he called me Sonny. Sonny, if you can't give it 100%, don't do it. My second motivation was I wanted to be a major league ball player. But after my days playing high school ball, I realized my skills just weren't that good. I became a policeman. I wanted to be the best policeman. I looked around. I saw homicide was the place to be. I did everything in my power to become a homicide inspector. And when I achieved that position, I looked at every case was like a new ball game. And the only way you got to hit a home run is by solving that case. So it was a challenge, and I always tried to live up to what my father told me, give it 100%. Some cases, unfortunately, you hit a wall. There's nowhere else to go, even though you may know the suspect. And it breaks your heart because you're trying to help the victim's family. And you really do build a bond with these people. And you can't go any further because the law and the lack of evidence, lack of witnesses. So some cases remain unsolved.
Was your aspiration always to be a homicide inspector and stay a homicide inspector versus move up the chain of command and become, chief one day like so many people have their sights set on?
Well, in my day, when I came in, I was under Chief Thomas Cahill, homicide inspector. His replacement was Alfred Nelder, homicide inspector. These guys were the cream of the crop, the top cops. Somewhere after Nelder, the city decided we have to maybe go in a different direction. Instead of top cop leading the cops, we're going to try and get a little bit better mix. So we ended up with people that were a little bit more politically in line with the city's thinking at that time.
San Francisco was a big focus of major motion pictures and the media. You had the Streets of San Francisco, you had movies like Dirty Harry and Bullet. What was it like living that reality that so many people were seeing in major media?
San Francisco is major media. It's just a city that's alive. Every day I drove around the city, I felt like I was playing an important role in keeping the city safe and the bully cowering and afraid to commit crime. So I felt like I was really an asset to keeping San Francisco safe. I may have had a grand idea in my mind, but I really felt that in my heart, that we were there to protect the citizens.
Now, you were involved in some of the most defining moments of the city, and you've written about that in your new book. Tell me what inspired you to finally put this down on paper for people to read.
My whole life as a policeman, even as an officer in uniform, I was always a storyteller because I found people fascinating. So telling stories was just who I was. And my wife would look at me and say, write it down, write a book, write it down. And I would laugh. But once I became a homicide inspector, over the years I started realizing for some reason I was catching more high-profile cases than other detectives. So I started cherry-picking cases I thought a little bit out of the ordinary, interesting cases that maybe someday I could write about. And that thought stayed with me into my retirement years. And I had several people approach me to write my book. And for some reason, it never happened. I never felt comfortable until about 2 years ago. an old friend called on the phone. It was a Chronicle reporter, now retired, by the name of Duffy Jennings. He said, "Hey, Falzon, how come you're not reading my book?" Duffy Jennings had just written a memoir on his life called The Reporter's Notebook. I said, "Oh, geez, I didn't know you wrote a book, Duffy. I'll tell you what I'll do. When I get off, I'll buy your book on Amazon." He said, No, I'm calling you to tell you I just put a book in the mail to you." I thanked him. I said, "After I read it, I'll get back to you." Well, his book was fascinating. I loved it. So when I called him back to congratulate him, he said, "Did you ever think of writing a book?" I said, "Of course. I've got tons of stories. I just never found the right person to write it." He said, "Look, Frank," he says, "I know you. We worked together in the 70s. Can I see your material?" I said, "Sure." I sent him my material. He looked at it, called me back. He said, "I want to write this book." And that's how it started. Duffy and I hooked up, and a year and a half later, we have a book called 5 Henry 7.
And what is 5 Henry 7?
5 Henry 7 was my call number. Whenever Operations Center wanted me and I was in a patrol car or an unmarked police car, Operations would say 5 Henry 7. The 5 stood for the Inspectors Bureau. The H, Henry, stood for homicide. I was number 7.